The year the revolution was supposed to die was 1776, when military disasters accumulated so rapidly that American independence seemed doomed before it could be achieved. Opens with disaster unfolding across summer and autumn as British forces systematically dismantled Continental Army's defensive positions around New York, demonstrating professional military superiority that made American resistance seem futile. The fall of New York in September, after British amphibious operations captured city and drove Continental forces from Manhattan, strategic loss, eliminating major American port and demonstrating British capability for projecting power anywhere along coast. Washington's retreat across New Jersey following New York's loss became desperate flight as demoralized Continental forces abandoned positions and equipment, while British pursued confidently, expecting complete American collapse. Enlistments expiring as soldiers whose one-year commitments ended in December prepared to go home regardless of military situation, pending mass departure threatening to reduce Continental Army to skeleton force, incapable of resisting British advances. Morale collapsing when defeats and retreats convinced many soldiers that continuing resistance was pointless sacrifice. Desertion rates climbing as confidence in ultimate victory disappeared. British armies rolling forward untouched through New Jersey, encountering minimal resistance as Continental forces retreated toward Pennsylvania. British confidence growing as American military weakness became apparent. The revolution hangs by thread in December, when Washington commanded fewer than 3,000 effective troops and when British controlled vast territories, while Americans held shrinking enclaves around Philadelphia. And into this chaos steps unknown, 19-year-old whose background gave him no obvious qualifications for significance, but whose courage and intelligence would provide Washington with information that changed war's trajectory. With mission that will flip war on its head through providing intelligence, allowing Washington to plan operations that would reverse momentum and revive American morale when military situation seemed hopeless, making teenagers' contribution decisive for revolution's survival at moment when American independence seemed about to die through military defeat and through collapse of popular will to continue resistance against British forces, whose victories had demonstrated their superiority over Continental Army that desperately needed advantages that teenage spies' intelligence would provide during revolution's darkest moment. The boy no one noticed was 19-year-old, whose youth and unremarkable appearance allowed him to move through occupied territories without attracting attention that older or more distinctive men would have generated. Introduce young man whose identity remains uncertain because records were destroyed or suppressed for protecting him and for protecting intelligence networks whose existence Washington concealed from British and from posterity. Humble background without wealth or social connections that would have made him known to authorities, his anonymity being asset rather than liability when intelligence work required invisibility. No military rank because he served as civilian agent rather than as uniformed soldier. Lack of official position protecting him from being treated as combatant if captured. No connections to powerful families or to political leaders who might have vouched for his loyalty, but whose associations would have made his movements suspicious to British authorities, monitoring prominent patriots' relatives and associates. Just intelligence in sense of mental acuity and observational skills that allowed him to gather and interpret information that others might have overlooked or misunderstood. Nerve, meaning courage, to operate behind enemy lines where capture meant execution as spy. Psychological strength, allowing him to maintain cover despite constant danger. And willingness to take risks older men feared because experienced soldiers understood dangers that youth's inexperience made seem manageable, his age being advantage when recklessness seemed like courage. Older men feared attempting because they understood consequences of capture and because they had families and positions worth protecting, risk calculations making intelligence missions seem suicidal for men with responsibilities. No one noticed him because youth and humble origins made him forgettable, allowing him to blend into occupied cities' population where distinctive individuals would have attracted surveillance, making anonymity his greatest asset when undertaking mission that required him to observe without being observed by British forces, controlling New York, whose security measures focused on known patriots rather than on unremarkable teenagers. whose presence seemed innocuous. A desperate army needs eyes was Washington's realization after retreating across New Jersey without accurate intelligence about British dispositions or intentions, blindness about enemy making defensive planning impossible. Washington realizes he's blind behind enemy lines when British-controlled territories were opaque to continental intelligence gathering, inability to penetrate British security, leaving Washington ignorant about enemy strength and plans. He's blind, meaning Washington lacked information about British forces' positions, strengths, and intentions. Intelligence vacuum, forcing him to react to British movements rather than anticipating them. Behind enemy lines, where British controlled territory and populations, making reconnaissance dangerous and making maintaining agent networks difficult when British security was effective at detecting and eliminating American intelligence operations. He quietly authorizes covert network without formal orders or official documentation that might compromise agents if captured. Washington's personal authorization protecting operatives through keeping their activities unofficial, quietly suggesting secrecy even within Continental Army, where British sympathizers might report intelligence operations to enemy, compartmentalization, protecting networks from exposure. Covert network of agents and couriers whose identities were concealed from each other and from Army generally, security through anonymity preventing single compromise from destroying entire intelligence apparatus. A 19-year-old is recruited for mission through personal connections or through demonstrating qualities that intelligence work required, his selection being based on assessment that youth and obscurity made him suitable for dangerous assignment. Senior officers refused to attempt because they understood mission's dangers and because their visibility made them unsuitable for covert operations, requiring blending into civilian populations, experienced officers' refusal, demonstrating mission's difficulty. To attempt suggesting that intelligence gathering in occupied New York was considered near suicidal mission that most rational people would decline, teenagers' acceptance, reflecting either courage or naivety, that made him willing to undertake operation, that older men's wisdom made them refuse, despite mission's importance for providing Washington with intelligence that Continental Army desperately needed for survival. Slipping into British-occupied territory required teenager to cross military lines, separating Continental and British forces without being detained by either side's pickets. The young spy disguises himself as civilian whose presence in British territory would seem legitimate rather than suspicious, cover identity being essential for avoiding immediate arrest upon entering occupied zone. As apprentice learning trade from master craftsman, cover story explaining youth's presence and providing reason for moving through city without arousing suspicion. Merchant conducting commercial business that British occupation had not completely disrupted. Trade continuing despite war, making merchant identity plausible for explaining movements. Or servant employed by household within British lines, domestic position explaining subordinate status, and providing access to locations where military information might be overheard. To blend into British-controlled New York, where tens of thousands of civilians continued living despite military occupation, anonymity, depending on appearing ordinary among population whose daily activities continued despite war. Into occupied city whose British garrison numbered thousands of soldiers billeted throughout Manhattan, military presence making intelligence gathering possible, but also making detection likely if spies' behavior attracted attention. British-controlled meaning authorities monitored movements and investigated suspicious activities. Security measures requiring spy to maintain cover consistently while gathering information. New York being strategic British base, whose importance made security stringent, city containing headquarters and supply depots, whose locations and contents were valuable intelligence. Territory where thousands of loyalist civilians actively supported British and reported suspicious activities, hostile population, making spies' mission more dangerous, when informants might notice inconsistencies in cover story or behavior that seemed suspicious, requiring teenager to maintain perfect performance of civilian role while simultaneously gathering military intelligence whose collection required access to sensitive locations and information that ordinary civilians would not seek, making his mission require balancing invisibility with active intelligence gathering during extended stay behind enemy lines. Gathering secrets no one else could reach was teenager's achievement through combination of access, observation, and memory that allowed him to collect information that Continental Army desperately needed. He overhears officers' conversations in taverns or lodging houses where British officers socialized, unguarded, talk providing information about operations and dispositions that formal documents would have contained, but that teenager could not access directly. Officers' conversations whose content assumed civilian listeners were either loyalists or were too ignorant about military matters to understand significance. British officers' casual discussion of operations providing intelligence that spy recognized as valuable. Studies troop movements through observing regiments marching through streets or assembling for exercises. Visual observation allowing him to estimate unit sizes and to track which formations were stationed in city. Maps artillery placements by noting where cannons were positioned for defending city or for supporting potential offensive operations. Artillery locations indicating defensive priorities and offensive capabilities. And tracks British supply routes by observing wagon traffic bringing provisions from ships to warehouses, logistics information revealing supply systems organization and vulnerabilities. Information that Washington desperately needs for understanding British capabilities and intentions, intelligence gaps, making continental defensive planning nearly impossible when Washington lacked basic knowledge about enemy dispositions. Desperately because without intelligence, Washington was operating blindly, making decisions based on assumptions rather than on facts about British strength and plans. Needs for planning continental operations and for avoiding British traps, accurate intelligence being essential for Army's survival when mistakes could be fatal for outnumbered continental forces. No one else could reach because other intelligence efforts had failed to penetrate British security in New York, where teenagers' youth and cover identity allowed access that more obvious spies could not achieve, making his intelligence unique contribution, providing Washington with detailed information about British forces in their main base that other sources had been unable to obtain through covert operations that British security had detected and eliminated before intelligence could be transmitted. The moment British start hunting him occurred when security officials noticed inconsistencies in teenager's cover story or when his movements attracted attention, suggesting he was gathering intelligence rather than conducting legitimate civilian business. A patrol notices inconsistencies in story about his background or his business that investigation revealed as fabrications, suspicion triggering enhanced surveillance, making continued operations dangerous. Inconsistencies in details about employer or residence that checking revealed were false, fabrication being detected through routine security measures or through informant reports. In his story, whose elements did not match when investigated, contradictions suggesting that cover identity was false and that teenager was probable spy whose activities warranted investigation. Informants begin whispering about boy spy whose youth and movements had been noticed by loyalist civilians who reported suspicious activities to British authorities, gossip creating danger when security forces started actively searching for teenage agent. About boy whose age was distinctive characteristic that made descriptions specific enough for authorities to narrow search, youth being liability when it made him memorable. Spy whose activities were suspected based on behaviors that seemed inconsistent with cover story, accumulating evidence suggesting teenager was gathering intelligence despite efforts to appear as ordinary civilian. He must move constantly to avoid British patrols searching neighborhoods where informants had reported suspicious youth, mobility being essential for evading capture when authorities were actively hunting him. Observing without being observed becoming nearly impossible when British security was specifically looking for him, challenge requiring extreme caution when continuing intelligence gathering while evading search. Without being detected by patrols who were now warned to watch for teenage spy, surveillance requiring him to balance information gathering with personal security when every encounter risked recognition and arrest, making final days behind British lines desperately dangerous, as teenager attempted to extract himself from occupied territory before British security forces could locate and capture him, despite active search that made remaining in New York. increasingly risky. The escape that should have failed was teenagers' extraction from British-occupied New York when security forces were actively searching for suspected spy whose description matched his appearance. Cornered inside British lines by patrols blocking usual exit routes, the teenager faced immediate capture unless he could find alternative method for leaving occupied territory whose security had been tightened specifically to prevent his escape. Inside British lines meaning he was surrounded by military forces and by civilian informants who would report suspicious movements to authorities, geography and population both being obstacles to escape. He slips through, using knowledge of city's layout and using opportunism for exploiting gaps in British surveillance, his youth and quick thinking allowing improvised escape route. Through alleys whose narrow passages allowed avoiding main streets where patrols were concentrated, knowledge of urban terrain allowing him to move through city without using obvious routes. Kitchens of taverns or inns where servants' entrances provided passages through buildings, service areas being less monitored than public spaces. Taverns, where crowds provided anonymity and where multiple exits allowed evading pursuers who entered through front entrances. And ferries that crossed rivers providing access to territories outside direct British control, water transportation being less easily monitored than land routes where checkpoints could stop travellers. Surviving by seconds at every turn when patrols missed him through luck or through his quick reactions, narrow escapes, demonstrating how close capture came repeatedly during extraction from occupied zone. At every turn, meaning throughout escape route, teenager faced moments where detection seemed inevitable, but where fortune or skill allowed him to evade searchers. The succession of near captures, making successful escape seem miraculous when examining how many times he barely avoided patrols whose mission was capturing spy matching his description, making extraction from British New York seem impossible for lone teenager facing professional security forces whose numbers and organization should have guaranteed his capture, if not for combination of courage, improvisation, and extraordinary luck that allowed him to reach continental lines despite British efforts. The map that changes everything was detailed intelligence report that teenager delivered to Washington after escaping from British-occupied New York, information transforming Continental Army's strategic position through eliminating uncertainty about British intentions. He delivers detailed account through verbal briefing or through written report compiled from memory after reaching safety, intelligence being comprehensive rather than fragmentary, because extended stay behind enemy lines had allowed systematic observation. Detailed account of British plans whose specificity exceeded anything Continental intelligence had obtained previously, precision about enemy intentions, allowing Washington to plan responses rather than merely reacting to British movements. British plans to advance deep into New Jersey, whose details included routes, timing, and objectives that British commanders intended for campaign aimed at destroying Continental Army and capturing Philadelphia. To advance indicated British were planning offensive operations rather than remaining defensive in New York, intelligence about offensive intentions allowing Washington to prepare defensive responses. Deep into New Jersey meant British intended to pursue Continental forces aggressively, rather than being satisfied with controlling coastal cities, operational depth, threatening Continental Army's survival if British attacks succeeded. Exactly where British columns would advance along specific roads whose names and features teenager had learned through overhearing planning discussions, geographic precision allowing Washington to position forces optimally. And when operations would begin based on dates mentioned in British planning or based on preparations teenager had observed. Timing intelligence allowing Washington to prepare defences before British struck. They will strike meaning British intended decisive offensive operations aimed at destroying Continental Army, teenagers' intelligence revealing that British believed they could end rebellion through winter campaign. Changes everything because Washington now possessed intelligence, allowing him to avoid British traps and to plan operations based on understanding enemy intentions rather than guessing about British plans, making teenagers' information decisive advantage that transformed strategic situation from desperate ignorance into informed defensive planning that would allow Continental Army to survive British winter offensive through avoiding positions where British intended to attack and through positioning forces where they could respond effectively to British movements whose details Washington now understood. Washington's first real advantage came from possessing detailed intelligence about British plans that teenagers' espionage had provided. Information allowing Continental Commander to make strategic decisions based on knowledge rather than on assumptions about enemy intentions. With this intelligence about British operational plans and dispositions, Washington can plan continental movements and positions for avoiding British attacks while preserving army whose survival was essential for continuing revolution. Washington avoids multiple traps that British planned for destroying Continental forces, intelligence allowing him to recognize which positions would become killing zones and to evacuate them before British attacks materialized. Multiple suggesting that British operational plan included several convergent movements designed to surround and destroy Continental Army. Teenagers' intelligence, revealing all planned British axes of advance. Relocates key units from positions where they would have been vulnerable to British attacks into defensive positions that were more secure. Intelligence-based repositioning, saving units from destruction. Key units whose loss would have crippled Continental Army being moved to safety before British offensive began. Preservation of combat power depending on intelligence that allowed anticipating British movements. And preserves army whose survival through winter depended on avoiding decisive engagement with superior British forces. Strategic withdrawal, based on intelligence being essential for Continental Army's continued existence. Long enough to attempt counterstroke because avoiding British traps preserved sufficient combat power that offensive operations became possible when circumstances favored Americans, intelligence buying time necessary for planning counterattack. To attempt suggesting that without intelligence, Continental Army would have been destroyed before counterstroke was possible, teenagers' espionage being prerequisite for Trenton operation, counterstroke meaning offensive operation against British or Hessian forces, intelligence about enemy dispositions, allowing Washington to identify vulnerable targets whose destruction might reverse war's momentum, through demonstrating that Continental Army remained capable of offensive operations despite recent defeats, making teenagers' intelligence decisive contribution to strategic situation that allowed Washington to survive immediate crisis while planning operations that would transform revolution's trajectory through achieving surprise. Victory that British superiority had made seem impossible, until intelligence advantage that teenage spy had provided gave Washington information necessary for planning attack. The spy's information enables attack at Trenton through providing intelligence about Hessian garrison, whose vulnerabilities Washington exploited for planning surprise assault on Christmas night 1776. Washington uses teenage spies' details about garrison composition, fortification, strength, and defensive preparations for understanding which target would be vulnerable to surprise attack that Continental forces could execute despite their weakened condition. On Hessian placements throughout Trenton, whose locations teenager had observed or had learned about through intelligence gathering in British New York, where operational planning for forward garrisons was discussed. Placements meaning specific positions of Hessian units within town and surrounding areas, geographic intelligence, allowing Washington to plan approach routes that would achieve surprise. Patrol shifts whose timing and routes teenager had learned through observation or through overhearing discussions. Knowledge about when guards would be changed, allowing Washington to time attack for maximum surprise. And weaknesses in Hessian defensive preparations, including inadequate fortifications or complacency about American capabilities, intelligence about vulnerabilities allowing Washington to exploit gaps in enemy security. To plan surprise Christmas attack whose timing exploited holiday when Hessian garrison would be less alert, weather when winter storm would provide concealment for Continental approach, and vulnerabilities that teenagers' intelligence had revealed. Christmas being chosen for attack based on intelligence, suggesting that holiday celebrations would reduce Hessian alertness, timing being informed by spies' information about garrison routine. Attack at Trenton becoming possible because teenagers' intelligence had provided Washington with detailed knowledge about target, whose characteristics made it vulnerable to surprise assault that Continental Army could execute despite recent defeats having reduced American combat power and morale, intelligence being essential for operation, whose planning required understanding garrison's strength, positions, and routines that Washington could not have obtained without spies' dangerous mission behind British lines, providing information that transformed Trenton from unknown target into mapped objective, whose vulnerabilities Washington could exploit through surprise attack designed to achieve tactical victory that would reverse revolution's momentum at moment when American independence seemed doomed. The victory that saves revolution occurred at Trenton on December 26, 1776, when Continental forces achieved complete tactical surprise against Hessian garrison, whose capture demonstrated that American arms could still achieve victories despite recent defeats. Trenton succeeds through combination of surprise that teenagers' intelligence had made possible, aggressive execution by Continental forces whose desperation motivated them, and Hessian garrison's unpreparedness for attack they had not anticipated during winter when conventional warfare typically paused. The morale of dying army revived immediately when victory demonstrated that Continental forces could defeat professional European troops, success reversing psychological collapse that defeats had produced. Of dying army whose enlistments were expiring and whose soldiers were demoralized being transformed through victory that gave them reason to believe that continued service might produce ultimate success rather than inevitable defeat. Enlistments renewed as soldiers whose commitments were expiring agreed to continue serving after Trenton victory, restored confidence in Continental Army's capabilities, military success being essential for maintaining force strength. Renewed because victory convinced soldiers that army could win battles and that continued resistance might achieve independence. Psychological transformation being as important as tactical success. And revolution, given new life through Trenton, demonstrating to American populations and to foreign observers that rebellion had not been crushed despite British victories during 1776, survival, depending on maintaining credible military resistance. Given new life, meaning that revolution's continuation became possible when Trenton victory prevented complete collapse that seemed imminent before attack succeeded. 19-year-old's intelligence directly fuels first American victory in months through providing Washington with information necessary for planning operation, whose success depended on achieving surprise that intelligence about Hessian vulnerabilities had made possible, making teenagers' espionage decisive contribution to Trenton, whose victory saved revolution from collapse by reversing momentum and by reviving American morale at moment when military situation seemed hopeless and when most observers expected Continental Army to dissolve through desertions and expired enlistments, demonstrating that teenagers' dangerous mission behind enemy lines had provided intelligence that changed war's trajectory through enabling Washington to plan and execute victory that gave revolution new life. The teenager who vanishes into history disappeared from Continental Army records after delivering final intelligence reports, his subsequent fate being unknown because documentation was destroyed or because he resumed civilian life without maintaining contact with military authorities. After delivering his final report containing last intelligence gathered during mission behind British lines, teenager's service apparently ended, though circumstances of his departure remain unclear. He disappears from Army rolls completely, with no subsequent documentation about his service or fate, absence from records being so complete that historians cannot definitively identify him from surviving Continental Army documentation. From rolls, meaning his name was removed or never formally recorded, administrative erasure making him untraceable through normal historical methods. Some say he returned home to resume civilian life after completing dangerous mission, whose success had fulfilled his service obligation, speculation about peaceful retirement being optimistic interpretation of his disappearance. Returned, suggesting he survived mission and chose to leave military service, though lack of documentation makes this explanation uncertain. Others say he stayed underground, continuing intelligence work without official recognition, alternate theory being that disappearance from records reflected continued covert operations requiring complete anonymity. Underground meaning he continued espionage under deep cover that required severing all connections to Continental Army that might compromise his activities or identity. Forgotten by history that focused on prominent generals and famous battles, while overlooking individual agents whose contributions were deliberately concealed for operational security, teenagers' anonymity being so complete that even basic biographical information cannot be reliably established from surviving documents. Into history, meaning his name and fate were lost to historical record through combination of deliberate suppression for protecting intelligence networks and through historians' focus on documented military operations rather than on covert activities whose secrecy made them invisible to scholarship, leaving teenagers' identity and ultimate fate as mysteries that fragmentary evidence suggests existed, but that conclusive documentation cannot establish definitely. Washington never reveals his name was deliberate decision for protecting teenage spy and for protecting intelligence networks, whose effectiveness required maintaining operational security even after war ended. For his protection from British retaliation that naming him would have invited, anonymity being essential for spies' safety when British hunted for agents who had operated behind their lines. And protection of network whose methods and members Washington concealed from public knowledge to preserve operational security, revealing teenagers' identity risking exposure of other agents and of techniques that future operations might employ. Of network meaning continental intelligence operations whose effectiveness depended on secrecy that public disclosure would have compromised, organizational security requiring that agents remain anonymous. Washington buries his identity forever through destroying correspondence and through refusing to discuss intelligence operations in memoirs or in official reports, commander's silence, ensuring that teenagers' name would not appear in historical record. Forever suggesting permanence of concealment that Washington maintained throughout his life, protection of spies' identity being priority that outweighed historical documentation. Only scattered references in private letters reveal that teenage spy existed, fragmentary documentation providing hints about his mission without identifying him specifically. In private correspondence that Washington or other officers wrote suggesting that young agent had provided crucial intelligence, references being oblique rather than explicit to maintain security. Reveal that teenager was revolution's unseen savior, whose intelligence had enabled Trenton victory, and whose espionage had provided Washington with information that preserved Continental Army during critical period when military situation seemed hopeless, scattered evidence indicating significance of contribution without establishing identity. That teenage spy existed, and that his intelligence was decisive for revolution's survival, being suggested through fragmentary references that historians can interpret without being able to identify specific individual whose courage and intelligence provided Washington with advantages that transformed strategic situation during 1776's desperate winter when American independence seemed doomed until teenagers' espionage gave Continental commander information necessary for planning operations that would save revolution from collapse. Washington never reveals. His name was deliberate decision for protecting teenage spy and for protecting intelligence networks whose effectiveness required maintaining operational security even after war ended. For his protection from British retaliation that naming him would have invited, anonymity being essential for spies' safety when British hunted for agents who had operated behind their lines, and protection of network whose methods and members Washington concealed from public knowledge to preserve operational security, revealing teenagers' identity risking exposure of other agents, and of techniques that future operations might employ. Of network meaning continental intelligence operations whose effectiveness depended on secrecy that public disclosure would have compromised, organizational security requiring that agents remain anonymous. Washington buries his identity forever through destroying correspondence and through refusing to discuss intelligence operations in memoirs or in official reports, commander's silence, ensuring that teenagers' name would not appear in historical record. Forever suggesting permanence of concealment that Washington maintained throughout his life, protection of spies' identity being priority that outweighed historical documentation. Only scattered references in private letters reveal that teenage spy existed, fragmentary documentation providing hints about his mission without identifying him specifically. In private correspondence that Washington or other officers wrote, suggesting that young agent had provided crucial intelligence, references being oblique rather than explicit to maintain security. Reveal that teenager was revolution's unseen savior, whose intelligence had enabled Trenton victory, and whose espionage had provided Washington with information that preserved Continental Army during critical period when military situation seemed hopeless, scattered evidence indicating significance of contribution without establishing identity. That teenage spy existed, and that his intelligence was decisive for revolution's survival being suggested through fragmentary references that historians can interpret without being able to identify specific individual whose courage and intelligence provided Washington with advantages that transformed strategic situation during 1776's desperate winter when American independence seemed doomed until teenagers' espionage gave Continental commander information necessary for planning operations that would save revolution from collapse. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.